Over the past several years, content strategists have discovered UX design, and UX designers have discovered content strategy. Brittney Urich has been bridging those disciplines from the very start of her career. Brittney is now a senior user experience designer at Ogilvy, a venerable creative agency that's been around since the mid-1800s. We had a fun conversation about how Brittney works with both her clients and her colleagues to show how content and design support each other.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 57 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Brittney Urich. She's a senior UX designer at Ogilvy's office in Denver, Colorado. Ogilvy's a big agency. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But Brittney, welcome to the show. And tell the folks a little bit more about your background and what you do there at Ogilvy.
Yeah, hi, thanks for having me. So right now at Ogilvy, like you said, I'm a senior user experience designer, but my unofficial title there is also a content strategist, so I get to be a little bit of a hybrid. So my undergraduate degree was in professional writing, and that was a pretty heavy emphasis on content strategy, but we also took some design classes. And so I really found that I loved both user experience design and content strategy. So what I do now at Ogilvy is actually, teach different people how to integrate content strategy into their design process. And I might come at it from the content strategy side and be working with other designers, or I might be working with content strategists as a formal designer on the team. But really, I'm working on marrying those two practices on whatever project I am on with Ogilvy.
That's cool. So you're doing client work, but you're also doing a lot of internal education, working with getting UX people up to speed on content strategy and vice versa, content people up to speed on UX practice?
Yep, that's right. So I work on client projects 90% of the time, but there is a bit of internal education. Is just a lot of times that comes from working on projects with people, if they've never worked with a content strategist before and they're trying to figure out, how to integrate content into their design process. Or vice versa, if it's content strategists that are used to working on projects that are really content strategy or UX writing heavy, that maybe haven't always worked with designers. So a little bit of internal education, but also a lot of client education, because not a lot of clients realize that content is a pretty big part of the user experience, and it's why people are, there for the designs in the first place. So I get to do a lot of client education, which I love.
Yeah, no, and I think that's something that, I was at Confab last year and I was just at LavaCon last week, and at both conferences, UX writing was huge, and that's it's come of age in the discipline of content strategy anyway, and it's well known, but still a lot of educating to be done out there. How do you do that? What are there common issues that come up, kind of entry points into that education process that get the conversation started?
Yeah, I think that, I always try to start from the very beginning, right? If we're going to be doing a design project, let's make sure that content is in the room from the get-go, right? As we're talking about brand expression, and from a visual perspective, that might be, what does it look like? What kind of style aesthetic are we going for? Do we want it to be minimal? Do we want it to be bold? Well, then how do we marry the voice with that so that, we don't just have this bright, bold personality as a visual design? We're also going to be a little more fun and energetic when it comes to our voice and tone. So I love to get people in the room from the get-go and thinking about, not just what does our brand feel like from a visual perspective, but what does our brand look and sound like, and how do you expect it to talk to you, and how does it talk to you at the end of the day? So I think the key there is just making sure that everyone is involved at as many points of the process as possible so that you can be aligned.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of gets at the whole unified customer experience nowadays, is that it's and that idea. And I love that you're baking in content from the very start. I think most agencies, are doing that. Do you have a feel for that? It seems like most agencies are doing that, and most of the people I talk to are. But I get the sense from the way people talk that that's not always the case. Is that part of your education process, that people have worked with other agencies that aren't as content first?
Yeah, that's definitely part of the education. I think that a lot of times, at least when I come in on clients, they expect content to be, filled in and sprinkled in at the top after we've actually, designed the pages, and we know what wants to be on the page, but we already have the content for that page, so we'll just slap it on at the very end. When the reality is that, the way the content is written or the format of the content is actually going to be dictating, what we're designing. And if it's the best layout to have things in different cards versus like a block paragraph versus maybe some icons and little columns and pictograms going on, the way that you write that content is going to determine the layout of the design and vice versa. So I find a lot of times that clients are surprised that we want to be talking about content so early, because they tend to think that once it's been written, it's done. And that's all there is to it. But we kind of have to bring them in and, okay, let's rethink this. How can we transform this to make it a better experience from all sides?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. You got me thinking about like I'm old enough to remember the old, Mad Men era almost of advertising. I worked in New York for a while and had a lot of friends in that world. And the way you're talking there is like that sort of like you present a comp and then you just finish it up and it's done and then you publish it kind of idea. Whereas like nothing happens that way anymore. And exactly. And you have to integrate it all the way through. Well, that's interesting. So what kind of projects are you working on mostly? I know, is Ogilvy kind of a full service agency now, or do you have like any like particular market that you serve or focus to your practice?
Yeah, so I sit on the experience design team, but what Ogilvy has rolled out in the last year, 2 years is what's called the OS, which is a full integrated service offering and operating system that sort of integrates all of the different capabilities. So we try to make sure that we're making brands matter both online or in print or in ads or in like however that might be. But we try to look at it from a holistic perspective. So, how do we think about, the same brand translating in a print ad versus, a, TV spot versus our web experience, and how do we make that cohesive throughout? That's one of the things that I see a lot with clients is, they have all these different, pieces, but it's not necessarily telling a cohesive story, or they have a really good ad that's driving people to their website. When you get to the website, you're met with an experience that just doesn't match, what they've been selling. And that's a really jarring experience for a lot of users, after you've built all of that brand trust. So we try to eliminate some of that by, looking at it from a holistic perspective.
That's interesting. So your relationships with your clients, are you typically at least involved from end to end and all those things, like because like magazine creative or TV creative or other, exhibit stuff or something like that, all those various destinations messages by which they might end up at your website or something else. How do you stitch all that together? Are you working with branding people and other folks in the organization, or is there a sort of a central like client person that's stitching it all together?
Yeah, it totally depends on the client. Our experience design team is much more project based. So we'll come in and we will be doing, one scope of work for X many weeks, depending on, what we're doing. And that might be redesigning a section of the website, redesigning the entire website, working on mobile optimization for it. That might be, doing app design for Android and iOS so that it feels a little more native than the current app does. So we come in and plug in at whatever point, makes the most sense for our clients. So we want to make sure that we're tailoring that project to their specific needs and not just redesigning a website for the sake of redesigning a website. But being a part of the broader Ogilvy system allows us to, when we have those clients where we have, the bigger, broader relationships with, I might just come in, even if it's only one other designer and I might come in and lend a hand as we're designing, a new web experience or a microsite, just so that it can feel cohesive with whatever the branding team has been working on. So sometimes we're working, in our own little universe with just the experience design team, but, most of the time we're actually plugging into the different projects and brands that, the broader Ogilvy is working with.
Got it. I'm curious about, are these mostly media, kind of media campaigns, or do you ever do like more, do you build apps for people or other or digital products for your clients?
Yeah, we'll do a lot of app building. We do have a development team that sits in New York. So if we want to develop things in-house, we will. But within our experience design team, we have researchers, data strategists, designers, UX writers, content strategists. So we can really do just about anything. But the last couple projects I've been on, I have redesigned a mobile app for both Android and iOS. I've just rolled off of a mobile optimization project, so making sure that our websites are great for mobile experiences of all different screen sizes. So we will really do pretty much anything and everything as long as it helps create a better experience. We're really focused on creating human-centered design, and as long as we're staying true to that promise, that's what we're going for.
Yeah, interesting. I was talking. You're reminding me of my last guest was Kylie Hansen at Microsoft. She directs a big UX group there that works on their Azure cloud stuff and their AI stuff. And you reminded me of the difference between in-house, and her job has an equally ambitious and deep and broad span. But it seems like in an agency setting, you must have a lot of learning opportunities because you're working with so many different kinds of clients and different kinds of projects. Do you each have kind of like a broad set of skills that lets you do that, or do you kind of have team members you call on for particular projects?
Our core has been for the last few years finance and healthcare. So I've gotten really familiar with all of the different financial terms that I could possibly use on a digital experience. But we do have a lot of people, that have just the domain knowledge with certain clients where they've been working in the tech sector or the healthcare sector, and we know that they're going to be the best fit for a certain project. But because we have people divided up by role, if we need a researcher on a project, I know that I'm going to grab one of my coworkers that sits on the research team. I'm sort of one of the few hybrids at our practice where I do design and content, so I could be plugged in on either side or both on a project, which is a lot of fun. But for me, I've been specializing in finance and tech for the last pretty much 2 years. I've not really had a huge opportunity to get into the healthcare sector, but one of the things that I really love about working for an agency is being able to pick up that knowledge. It's always a learning curve. There's always something new to be, learned or taught or shared with a client, and that's why I love it. That's one of the most fun things I have.
Mm-hmm. It seems like there must also be a lot of opportunities for kind of cross-disciplinary pollination there to share things from one sector to another, from one practice to another.
Absolutely.
Tell me a little bit more about, because to me, the way the field of content strategy has evolved, I see I'm like totally focused on content strategy, but it's really hard to miss UX these days because that's such an influential discipline on what we're all doing these days. So you mentioned you studied both in school, but how are you a little bit of a unicorn in that sense in the way you stitch that together, or are there other folks that span both content and UX at Ogilvy?
I haven't found anyone that spans specifically content and UX, but we have people that span UX and research or data strategy and UX design. A lot of our content strategists focus on both content strategy and UX writing, which, like we talked about, UX writing is more of a sub-discipline within content strategy. But we have some people that are really, really strong on the writing side of things, but have the domain knowledge about content strategy, and some that are content strategists that are going to be looking at things from a higher level, but also know how to do UX writing. I think that I don't know that I'd call myself a unicorn because I know there are plenty of people that had my degree that had a similar exposure to both content and design. But it's something that I love being able to do because you're right, you can't really avoid UX design these days, but I feel like content strategy has been making enough noise that you can't really ignore that either. And, my whole spiel is and always will be that, they're both part of the user experience, right? Like people are coming to your website to read and learn something and digest information, and that's not going to go well if the content on the page isn't effective. And vice versa, you can't just put a Word document worth of content on a page and expect people to read and understand it in a quick and easy fashion.
Exactly. And I think that's the big enterprises have all figured that out. Like I've had people from Facebook, Google, Amazon, not Amazon, I'm sorry, Facebook, Google, and Microsoft. And they all kind of operate very similarly in that sense of that they all integrate, but they all have a way that their teams come together, and content design or content strategy is always a part of that. How do you put your teams together for each project that comes in? Do you sort of look at what the client needs, what your skill set are, kind of build a team, or do you have to learn on the fly a lot, or how does that work?
Yeah, so we have a resource manager. Her name's Sarah. She's great. And she looks at the projects as they come in and sort of decides, whose skills are going to be the most useful here. If it's a really, really content heavy project, we might have someone that's full-time that's, going to be doing content strategy or user experience writing. But a lot of our projects tend to be designed with a side of research and a side of data strategy and a side of content because we want to be attacking things from a holistic perspective. So what she does is she figures out, who's going to be the best on the team, also who happens to be available and isn't on other projects at the time. And she assembles teams that way. But we have been able to, sort of pull from all of the different aspects, just depending on what the project is. There are some clients that want to do research at the very beginning and they want to do a couple rounds of user testing. There are some clients that have been doing research in-house and they want to just do testing of the designs at the end. We kind of plug and play depending on what people need. But I have found that we've had a pretty good need for content and design on almost every project I've been on, which has been great.
Yeah, that's interesting what you just said about how much did the clients drive that kind of decision making? Like you were just saying, some of them prefer to do research up front, more maybe like usability testing at the end. Do you have any like best practices that you're trying to push or better practices in terms of like when and how you involve research in projects?
Yeah, I mean, if it were up to me, and I think most of our office would agree, I think research needs to be involved, throughout the entire process, right? Like we call, once we've done all of the research, researchers are going to pass it off to designers, content strategists, what have you. But it's infinitely more valuable to have that researcher stay on throughout the entire project and be reviewing the designs and be reviewing the content and say, this is what we heard. This is like the pain point that we're seeing in the journey map. This is what we're hearing from testing, and I think you need to change it. And when that researcher leaves that project, you sort of lose some of that knowledge, right? You're getting it secondhand, and you might have, a document that's telling you, here are all the things that you should be doing or should keep an eye out for, but it's not the same as, being the person that's pounding the pavement, sitting in on the interviews with users for 20, 30 hours that has all of that background knowledge. So I personally think that, it's invaluable to have a researcher on, throughout the entire project, even if they're not on full time during the design process. It's just nice to have that domain knowledge and then have someone that, then knows what they need to be testing later on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, the way you said that, it perfectly illustrates not just the research role, but the role of the content person, the role of the interaction designer. I mean, they all have, and like, again, back to comparison between enterprises and agency work, like in enterprises, like the kind of the best practice in the biggest, most well-funded places, is to have that team together as a unit throughout the project and kind of, sidestepping that issue you just mentioned. But I can see the exigencies of running an agency. You probably have to allocate, like, would you say her name? The resource lady, is kind of plugging people around. Can you, is there some sort of like administrative or bureaucratic duking it out there to try to get that talent on your team and keep it? Or how do you, because you'll have a sense of like, man, I wish I had that researcher here. Do you ever like have to, wrangle those kind of resources? Or
I think that she does a really good job of understanding what, the project needs are throughout the entire project. And so, we might have like a content person, for example. I might be only part-time in the middle of the project, once pages have been written. And I'm just there if someone says, hey, I think we should change this, or we're changing this design, how is this going to affect the content? But I'm not going to be on it necessarily full time. We do a really good job of making sure that we have, the balance of that. There are some clients that don't always want content or data strategy or research. And I think that, it's not so much an internal, how do we get these people on our team? It's more of a, educating the client as to why it's important to be having these people on the team in the first place, which is what we try to do every time we, have a kickoff. We do, sort of a full day of education of, here's our goals for the project. Here are the people that you're going to be seeing, and here's their roles and why that role matters, and how it's going to affect you at the end of the day. So I don't know that it's as much internal, like, man, get me a researcher back on this project, but I think that it's more with the clients, making sure that as we're talking through scopes of work with them, making sure that they understand the importance of having all of those people on the project.
Right, and you just reminded me another difference with the agency world is like whoever the account person is. It probably has to set those expectations about like, look, it's going to be a lot better if you budget for research in here. Or I don't know how they put the packages together, but is there some of that going on? Are you communicating with the account people about like, if you really want this project to go, you really need a dedicated content person or a researcher or whatever you see?
Yeah, so we're really lucky in that we have like a full service sales team, and they handle most of the projects. They look at, the ask of the client, the scope of work, and, here's what we think this needs to have on the team in order to be successful. So usually by the time something's been signed, we've determined, who's actually going to be on the team. And it might, fluctuate later on, but we know, who we think we need to have on that team to be successful. Because we are more project-based within the Experience Design Group. We don't have necessarily account people. We have, a couple higher up, account managers, but we have a project manager, what we call an engagement manager, that's on it day to day. And they're the ones that's, working with the client, working with the team, making sure everything's running smoothly, making sure we're hitting deadlines. And they're really the ones that are making sure that we have the people that we need to have in the room when we need to have them. But we're lucky in that our sales team, sort of irons this all out ahead of time. So we're not going into an engagement and going, hey, it'd be really nice if we could do some research on this. And I think it's just because we've been doing it for so long that, we know what we need before we even start projects.
Right. No,
in
that's
an
great.
ideal world, of course.
Yeah, no, but everything you said makes perfect sense. That having that, it sounds like your sales team. It's because I've known other agency people who have like the sales guys who will just do whatever it takes to make the sale, and then you figure it out later. It doesn't sound like that's at all the case at Ogilvy. So that's great.
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to take a little, not like a sidetrack, but we mentioned when we were talking before, even before you left Michigan State, you were running you had done a startup there, and we talked a little bit about how that was sort of the seed of your integration of UX and the content strategy practice. Can you tell me a little bit about, like, what was your startup, and what were the UX and content things that came up that led you to stitch them together?
Yeah, so my company was called Connector. It was a mobile application that essentially connected any students on campus to events. So anyone could create an event, anyone could RSVP to that event, and the goal was to create smaller communities on a massive campus. I went to Michigan State University, so there's 50,000 students there. And my friend that I founded the company with, we were talking one day and we said, what are the odds of us ever having met on a campus of 50,000 people if we didn't happen to be in this class with 20 people in it? And it's pretty slim. But knowing how well we got along and knowing that we would have never run into each other anywhere else on campus, we thought, how can we change that? How can we alleviate some of this stress of freshmen that get there and realize there's 8,000 people in their class and don't know, how to make connections with them? And so we've tossed around a couple ideas. We settled on an app, and we thought, okay, how do people connect? Like, this was before Tinder and everything else that, started to happen, and Twitter and Instagram were still taking off. And we thought, okay, it's kind of weird to just like friend a person that you've never met. What's a logical way to meet someone? And we settled on events. And so we thought, okay, Michigan State has 800 clubs on campus. All of those clubs can post events. I can post an event for, studying for my chemistry class so that I can maybe meet people that are in my chemistry class. And we just kind of played around with it. And we downloaded Sketch. Both of us had taken a web design course and a couple content strategy classes at that point. But, we'd never used Sketch or Adobe XD or any of these things that exist now. And we thought, okay, we'll put some screens together and see what we can do. So we ended up going a little overboard, did probably 120 different screens, and then entered ourselves in a pitch competition called Tech Week Chicago. Got accepted somehow, went down there and pitched it. And because we had created a prototype and envision, everyone that we were showing it to thought it already existed. Chicago is a pretty big hub for schools, colleges, universities, you name it. And people were asking, how do I get this? Where do I get this? And we thought, we could probably do something with this. So we went back to Michigan State and said, hey, what departments of this will fund it? Got some money from the university and ended up hiring a development firm to build it. But the entire time we were building it, one of the things that was most important to me was, what words are we using, right? Like, how are we labeling the tabs? How are we labeling the different types of events? What types of events exist? And we had, I think, 300 different types of events that you could, pick from, or classes or activities that you could, invite people to do with you. And it was just really important to me that all of those made sense, and all of those were the most logical thing for people to find or search for. And at that point, I was sort of like, oh man, like you can design this thing, but if I don't know, what the discover button does or like the alerts are for, then I'm totally lost. So that was sort of the first like seed planted of, okay, if I'm going to do the design, the content is just as important on this page.
That's great. I love that and I'm really curious, did they cover like taxonomy and ontologies and things in the program you were at Michigan State, or did you have to, because a lot of what you're talking about there, did you have to learn that on the fly as you're doing your startup, or was that part of the curriculum?
A lot of that we learned on the fly. My curriculum, so my degree was professional writing, and there were, 2 tracks. There was an editing and publishing track, and then a digital and technical track. And the digital technical was more content strategy, UX writing at like a very basic level. And that's where I sort of started to fall in love with it. I picked my degree because it was the only degree that had writing in the name. And I went, okay, I like this. I'll give it a try and see if I like it. And I thought that I was going to love, the editing and publishing field. And as soon as I took my first content strategy class, we read Content Strategy for the Web by Christina Halverson. And I went, oh, this is a whole new world. Like, this is what I want to do. But they were all pretty basic level classes. I know now they've split into a full experienced architecture and content strategy, program. So I think it's a little more robust, but a couple of years ago, that was not the case. It was still all emerging. That book was brand new.
Yeah, I don't watch it super closely, but I gather that college curriculums are evolving really quickly, trying to keep up with this stuff. Just here in Seattle, just at the UW alone, there's multiple programs that deal with that. Well, that's cool. So whatever happened with that startup? Did you launch an IPO and then retire to Ogilvy, or?
So we retired it a little while ago. We sold it to a couple colleges at Michigan State University, and gave them the ability to post all of their events for students, and see how students were engaging with them. Had a couple colleges that bought it, ran it for a few years after I graduated, and then retired it as I started to work not just at Ogilvy but in general after I'd left. It's one of those things where it has a special place in my heart and I love it, but you look back at some of the design work you did and you go, oh man. How is this ever going to work? And the same with the company in general. I think it was a really great learning experience for both of us. I mean, it was the first time I had ever worked with developers at all. So actually, watching the entire process of something that you've just dreamt up and sketched out on a piece of paper to turn into an actual full app was a great experience. But I think it was something that we both knew wasn't going to live on in the long run, just because there are so many other competitors in that space now that exist. Even Eventbrite alone has come out of at least nowhere for us. We were like, oh man, what is this? So I think it's been a great learning experience, but it's been retired for a little while now.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, congrats on that. That's great. I got to admit to a little envy here, because the first book you read when you discovered content strategy was Christina Hopperson's book. I'm going to go full old guy here and just say back when I was doing this, you had to make it up, because I started doing web stuff in the mid 90s, and we were just all waving our arms and trying to figure things out.
That's how I feel sometimes now too.
Well, I think, no, that's still the case. And everybody, I talk to really experienced content strategists who admit to a lot of imposter syndrome and holy crap, we're just making this up as we go. But, there's that, but there's also the woman I talked to last week, Kylie Hansen at Microsoft, she was talking about, she can demonstrate, for example, that if you integrate content design people into a product team, that you can double the improvement. You can double your usability of that product, and also increase the net promoter score by 8 points. Anyhow, whole bunch of data. So it actually, as we speak, I haven't published that episode yet. I'm a little behind on my production, but anyhow, you'll appreciate some of the data in there. There's actual data that supports the practice of UX design with content. And I think, and so you, as a fellow evangelist of this field, give you some more ammo there. So, hey, Brittney, we're coming up on time. I want to make sure I always give my guests the opportunity. Is there anything anything that we haven't talked about yet, or that's on your mind, or that's come up during the conversation that you want to make sure we talk about?
Yeah, I think, and maybe we touched on it a little bit earlier, but you'd asked how does a place like Ogilvy end up with an experience design practice, right? And that for me is one of my favorite, I guess I'll call it a story, right? It's one of my favorite things to talk about, because our company used to be Effective, and we'd been around for our experience design group. So Effective has been around for about 15 years now. And when I was first moving out to Denver, I was looking for user experience design agencies, and I was really looking for places that would also have content. And I called up one of the alumni from my college that, had a small agency here that was more graphic design focused, and said, if you had to pick a user experience design agency in Denver to, really, really go after and try to work for, where would you go? And she said, oh, you want a job at Effective. If you're going to do user experience design, you get a job there. I don't care how you do it, make it happen. And I, out of the blue, reached out, to our former CEO and said, I would love to work here. Did not happen until many months later. But that was the reputation we had, was, a really true, experience design group that really everyone, whether or not they were in the practice, respected. But we'd also been owned by Ogilvy for about 7 years, which no one really knew. So I think that when we rolled out, Ogilvy and, broader WPP decided that we were going to be one Ogilvy about a year ago, people were really, really surprised that Ogilvy had an experience design group, and that, Ogilvy had the capabilities to be, more digital. And the reality is, we've been a part of Ogilvy for so long. but we were just doing billing work as effective. And Ogilvy has really shifted to become more deeply digital in their services. And it's not just us. I mean, they have a specialty mobile app development group. They have people that focus on just SEO and SEM, other development, social media. It's one of those things that people don't necessarily tend to think of when they think of Ogilvy. But I mean, when I came out here, it was, oh, you want to work for Effective, and they are part of Ogilvy, and that's where you should go out of all places. I don't know that I should have taken just like one person's advice on it, but I was like very sold on it. I was like, great, if Ellen thinks that I should work at Effective, I'm going to work at Effective. And
No, it sounds like that worked out pretty well.
Yeah, it's been great, but it's just one of those things that I don't think people think of. And, usually when I have conversations with people, they go, isn't Ogilvy like traditional advertising? Like, weren't they around in like the like early 1900s, like 1800s? And I'm like, absolutely. But we're totally part of, their capabilities offering now. And we're really pretty digital, but that's one of my favorite things to talk about, just because it surprises people.
No, I love that, because when I was in college, I studied magazine journalism, and one of my favorite magazines of all time has been the Atlantic Monthly, and that's the oldest continuously published magazine. I think it goes back to about the same era that Mather, the predecessor to Ogilvy and Mather, and then all the things that came. I think they go back to like 170 years ago. And the Atlantic Monthly is now, the Atlantic.com is like one of the most progressive, like savvy, digitally forward thinking media sites out there. And similarly, Ogilvy, the guys that go back to the 19th century, are now this cool leading edge digital agency. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I always like to plug it, because I'm like, people talk to me and they're so surprised, but no, like it's what we do. It's why I love what I do, because we're not just focusing on design or the UI of things. It's a little bit of everything, and that's what makes it fun, and that's what makes it a full service human centered experience.
Yep. No, and I think that because so much we can't just discard old media and old ways of doing things as we adopt this. There's a lot of wisdom and lore and relationships in old companies like that, and it's very cool that sounds like they're doing a good job of crossing the digital divide and making that digital transformation. So.
Yeah, we've been calling it digital transformation. So it's like you've been listening in.
Oh, yeah, I have a hold. Anyhow, yeah. Well, thanks so much, Brittney. This has been a really fun conversation. I really appreciate getting to learn more about your work.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
You bet.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.